Today is February 22nd, 2024, and my guest is activist and writer Ahmed Fouad Alkhatib. His family is originally from Palestine before the establishment of the State of Israel. From the age of 5 to 15, he lived in the Gaza Strip until he went on an exchange program to the United States. He was unable to return to Gaza and ultimately became an American citizen. He's been an eloquent writer on what is happening in Gaza today. And in a recent article he wrote for Foreign Policy, he wrote the following, quote, "I am originally from Gaza. I have lost more than 31 of my family members who were killed by IDF airstrikes in Gaza City and Rafah. Both of my childhood homes are gone. My immediate and extended family are all homeless, having had to regularly flee in pursuit of safety. This personal dimension is precisely why I've been desperately seeking pragmatic ideas outlined below that address humanitarian aid provision and the stabilization of post-war Gaza through new security arrangements. This is not an intellectual or analytical issue for me. It is an existential one that threatens the survival of what remains of my family in the Gaza Strip and the preservation of the territory that I once called home." End quote. And those words will be the basis for our conversation today. Ahmed, welcome to EconTalk.
Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it.
I want to add, before we begin, this episode will probably air 3 weeks after it's recorded. Please keep that in mind. Things may change quickly for some of the issues we discuss. Let's talk about your boyhood in Gaza to start. That was during the time when Israel was occupying the Gaza Strip. Israel withdrew in 2005, and you left just as Hamas began to take power. Can you share your memories of Gaza as a boy?
Certainly. I mean, as I had shared previously, our family moved back and forth between Gaza and Saudi Arabia during the 90s. We lived in Gaza for almost 3 years out of that decade. We permanently moved to the Gaza Strip in June of 2000, right before the Second Intifada, 3 months before the Second Intifada. And I remember always feeling an outsider, if you will, because our accent that we spoke wasn't exactly 100% in accordance to the Gazans who never left the Strip. And so I remember that, but once the Second Intifada took place and once the violence began spreading as far as the demonstrations, the protests, the strikes, the funerals, the later on suicide attacks and suicide bombings that took place within Israel, which would then elicit a significant Israeli retaliation. Once that took place, I was very much so a Gazan, just like everybody else. There was a complete erasure of any differentiation. We went to UNRWA schools because our family's from historic Palestine, and my parents were born in Rafah. In refugee camps, and the word refugee camp, I mean, they started as actual literal refugee camps, but as time has gone on, they evolved to be their own mini small neighborhoods or even mini small cities, if you will. So that's why they're exceptionally crowded. They're particularly just undeveloped, and the scene historically of a lot of trash and sewer and whatever, even though as time has gone on, there have been efforts to improve them. But the area where we lived in Sheikh Radwan, right between the neighborhood of Rimal and Jabalia, you hear about the Jabalia refugee camp, that was, I would say, in a quasi-developed area where it was, we didn't have any sewers. The people had septic tanks, and I just remember, and we didn't have paved streets in the entirety of the area where we were in. So just from a quality of life point of view, anytime it rained, the streets would become these massive ditches because there was no drainage, no infrastructure. We went to UNRWA schools. It was crowded. It was rough. It was, they had 2 periods. They had the morning period and the afternoon period. And I always begged for the morning period. That way you could be done with school by 12:30, because I just despise going to school from 1 to 6. While UNRWA schools were very crowded, they had a serious lice problem. Anytime, I have an afro. I actually have hair, but I choose to shave it. But in Gaza, anytime you saw someone with my cut, you assumed that they had lice from school. And the UN and UNRWA would, well, I don't know that it was an UNRWA directive, but a lot of the UN teachers would instruct us to use gasoline to get rid of the lice. Nevertheless, I will say the UNRWA schools were very good in terms of the academic standards.
In the aftermath of October 7th, UNRWA schools have gotten a lot of criticism. And I think a lot of Israelis believe that they teach children to hate. I don't know if that is true today. Was it true to hate Jews? Excuse me, to be clear. Did you sense that in your time?
Well, it's complicated in the sense that I don't believe that UNRWA schools specifically teach to hate. UNRWA doesn't control the curriculum. That is controlled by the Palestinian Ministry of Education, which is driven by the West Bank-based ministry, which historically, when I was there, for example, I was in the first year of the pilot program for a new curriculum that was funded by the European Union. And I remember specifically, because I had a lot of family members involved in the Ministry of Education, I remember the stipulations that the European funders had for the curriculum, such that there were things that you could not, there were clear and explicit instructions on what could not be said. So I think where a lot of the incitement and the potential for hatred comes from the instructions provided by the teachers, some of whom just believe that, yeah, like some of whom basically editorialize the content. But I don't believe that UNRWA specifically and explicitly either teaches hate or, at least on paper, allows for the teaching of hate. UNRWA does have standards for what its teachers can and cannot say. I remember hearing stories of teachers getting in trouble when I was in Gaza for having overt political activism. Again, keeping in mind, this was before the withdrawal of Israeli settlements. This was before Hamas. Like, this was an entirely different era. So I concede that perhaps some things might have slightly changed. But and I'm not here to say that UNRWA was flawless, but I do think, unfortunately, there are reductionist, oversimplistic points of view and kind of statements made about UNRWA that are just factually wrong. They're just factually inaccurate. UNRWA doesn't control the curriculum, neither does Hamas. UNRWA schools, I will say, because so 2/3 of Gaza's populations are considered refugees, 1/3 are considered natives. Those are actual Gazans from Gaza. The 2/3, I mean, there are cultural and political kind of differences between those two subsets, those two populations. And even just amongst each other, like at least when I was there, and things have changed, but nevertheless, it still is a thing. It's even considered a big thing when the refugees, we call them muhajirin, marry from muwatnin, the natives. So like when you just people's last name can be indicative of, oh, where are you from? And they don't mean like what neighborhood do you live in? Like, where are you from? Like, are you what part of Palestine are you from? And so there is this kind of segregationist mentality that exists within Gaza's community that are descendants of refugees, such that those are the populations that go to school, to the UNRWA schools. That's the population that from which the teachers come. So therefore, there's very much so this sense of historic injustice, like we're kind of languishing in these, a lot of the students are living in horrible, crowded refugee camps and throughout the Gaza Strip. And a lot of them are aid dependent for a variety of reasons, including Hamas's, practices and choices later on. So I believe that's where a lot of the hatred that we hear about comes from.
Now, I mentioned on the program that I've seen, we actually hosted a showing of a documentary about Gaza here at Shalom College that was very sympathetic to the Gazan experience and was fascinating, and it was very depressing because it highlighted, the the shutting off of electricity frequently, the insufficient access to clean water sometimes, limits on activities in the ocean because of Israeli surveillance. But I always assumed, trying to be empathetic, that was all of Gaza, the slum-like poverty. And now it appears, and I just want your take on this, since the war started, we see lots of footage of parts of Gaza that look quite nice and developed. Are those videos true? Is it true? Were there swaths of Gaza City that looked like a resort that had luxury cars and so on? And was that part of your experience again in the time you were there up to 2005? Or that your relatives tell you about?
Certainly. No, I mean, and that's the irony. That's the nuance and the multiple truths and just the need for kind of an intricate understanding of this without the simplistic reductionist views on either side. Ironically, Gaza got its first shopping mall in the year 2010, and it was during the height of the Israeli blockade and restrictions. And it was also, ironically, a bunch of Hamas-affiliated businessmen who got together. I mean, Hamas invested in luxury and leisurely stuff and businesses and shopping centers, partly because it was a way for them to collect more taxes and a way for them to create an economic base that filled the vacuum due to the financial sanctions on them, the blockade, and it was an economic engine to help Hamas sustain its government and its group and its members. But also because, and as we've seen in other parts of the world, like with the kind of information technology, with digital technologies, like there is an economic evolution in different parts of the world, and that includes in the Gaza Strip, that has happened while the blockade took place, while 70% of Gazans became aid dependent, while youth unemployment reached 76%, while overall unemployment in Gaza kept worsening, reaching up to 41%. So that's what's challenging, is to understand that multiple things happen simultaneously. However, it is absolutely the case that there are beautiful parts of Gaza, partly because just random people decided to develop them, partly because there were businessmen and there was commerce, and partly because of Hamas-led initiatives. And I'll say finally that Qatar actually poured some of those billions of dollars that Qatar has poured into Gaza were in fact directed toward economic development and infrastructure projects that really transformed parts of Gaza.
So how much access have you had since you left Gaza in 2005 to information about what's happening there over that time period? I understand that there's a lot of restrictions on Gaza by Israeli security forces. We can debate whether those were justified or not. I don't want to. In a way, it doesn't matter. They obviously made life hard for people in Gaza. Whether they were defensive or not doesn't matter for this conversation. But have you been able to talk to people there over the last 20 years in general? Are you able to have open conversations via cell phone and in other ways to have a feel of what's happening on the ground there? And in particular, since October 7th.
Absolutely. So just generally speaking, yes, I have not only kept in contact with what's happening in Gaza, I've also very much so been, through family, through context, through friends, making a point of understanding the developments, political, economic, the humanitarian, kind of the security, having an understanding of how Hamas operates. What are they doing? Who are the players? How are the tunnels being dug? Who are, down to even understanding how Hamas even digs its tunnels. And I'm not saying I have information that other people may not have. I'm simply saying that in addition to keeping up through just the news and the analyses and the developments and the political events, I have been interested in Gaza because like I've shared in the foreign policy piece, I've always envisioned using the privilege of being in the United States, using the privilege of having lived there to ultimately turn around and do something useful and meaningful and pragmatic and practical that helps people there. So I had every intention of eventually being involved in Gaza's affairs, even though I didn't know how exactly that would transpire. Now, I haven't physically accessed Gaza since 2005, but I honestly would claim that I know Gaza in a way that most don't, by virtue of having family and having kept those contacts. I will further add that I launched a nonprofit organization in 2015 to advocate building an international airport, a humanitarian, internationally run, IDF-approved airfield in Gaza. And I worked through an army of volunteers and emissaries and intermediaries in Gaza to collect information and relay it to relevant parties. So that was also particularly helpful. Since October 7th, it's become exceptionally difficult to, just because the network doesn't work. There's no internet. Nevertheless, I do maintain contact with quite a few contacts and family members there.
And we'll put a link up to your nonprofit on this page. I'm curious about what it has been like for you to have access to American media, which of course is a mixed bag, like any media, but it is relatively, it's much freer than the media that your friends and family in Gaza are receiving, or at least I would think so. And you can correct me if I'm wrong. And I'm curious. I mean, you're a remarkable person, and I deeply appreciate you coming onto the program. I follow you on X, on Twitter, and you are the most one of the, if not the most thoughtful commentators on the situation and tragedy of what's happened since October 7th from a Palestinian perspective, which is why I invited you to be on the program. But I'm curious whether in this period where you're in the United States and you're interacting with people in Gaza, your impressions are different because of information you have access to that they don't, or vice versa, that they have experiences that you don't that color their attitudes. I mean, in particular, there's a lot of conversation. We've had some of it on this program about October 7th itself. A lot of people in Israel feel that a lot of Gazans supported October 7th, celebrated. We have video of some of that. And my answer has always been, my response to that is that, well, there were some people who celebrated. I don't know how many. It wasn't, in the video, it's not a large number. It's a large number for a city street. It's not a large number out of 2.2 million. There's also a question of whether people in Gaza know what happened. They're getting access to information that's could be highly limited. They may not know the scope of it. Hamas has, in Arab language broadcasts, has often said, Hamas leaders, we didn't attack any civilians. It was a military operation. So I'm just, it's a terrible, long, rambling question, but I'm curious if you could just reflect on differences in both perception and reality as you see it between someone living in America who's sympathetic to the Gazan people and people living there on the ground.
Absolutely. I mean, this is a recurring theme in terms of, yes, I mean, let's say 10,000 people celebrated. And I think that was shameful. And I think there was also just the initial, I think there was just the spectacle of having how the attack unfolded with the paragliders, with the naval commandos and the sappers blowing holes in the wall and the motorized units and the motorcycles and the massive, like the successive waves of the attack. Like that, I think to a lot of people was just unprecedented. And there was definitely a spectacle component of it. There was a wow component to it. And then scenes of Israeli Humvees being driven around Gaza. I mean, that's never happened before. Scenes of dozens of hostages being brought back to Gaza, some of them being paraded, some of them being subjected to horrendous abuse, which I once again think is shameful. Nevertheless, I immediately, and I remember very vividly, it was October 6th here, it was Friday night. And I had just come back from a long walk, and I went immediately to social media, which I have thousands and thousands of accounts that I check out and follow and whatever and list from my airport advocacy days. And I saw hundreds of posts of people saying, oh my God, you just signed our death sentence. Oh my God, Gaza as we know it is going to cease to exist. Some people opposed it some people, for example, I saw opposed the scene of that one elderly woman who was paraded on a golf cart, and they thought that this was shameful. Like, why didn't you at least put that woman in a closed off area and just like offer, this is an elderly woman. Like, why did you have to parade? Like, people detested the acts, anticipated the consequences, or knew that this is Hamas basically running away from its failures as a government, as a political entity, as an economic provider for the people of Gaza by launching this horrendous attack. I think the other thing that is absolutely true, in the same way that I have Israeli friends who tell me that in Israeli media right now, in the mainstream media at least, is very sanitized. You don't see images of dead Gazans. You don't see widespread imagery of the maiming and the killing. Similarly, in the Palestinian press and in kind of like the Arabic media, led by Al Jazeera, led by Hamas propagandists, they don't put it out there that Hamas killed civilians. Many Palestinians still believe that the Israeli military erroneously or deliberately killed a lot of its civilians during October 7th, either during the confusion of the battle or during the execution of the so-called Hannibal Directive, which may have been, some of that may have been true, but therefore they're like, oh, well, Hamas didn't kill any civilians. And Hamas put out this long statement recently about, well, we don't actually target civilians and we never have, utter lies, of course. So there's that component to it. What's shameful, in my opinion, is while I can understand why some people in Gaza think that way and are impacted by either, call it the conditioning, the priming, the circumstances, the totality of their lived experience, leading them to, or many of them, or some of them, to believe that. What I think is exceptionally shameful are the folks who purport to be pro-Palestinian in the Western world, where there is kind of a broader margin for accessing information and doing your own research and doing your own homework, parroting those Hamas talking points, further propagating the idea that this was strictly a military attack that did not target civilians. And that's where I think I talking to people on the ground in Gaza and interpreting them. I mean, even like some of my own like extended family members initially didn't believe that there were any civilian casualties. And when I sent them some pictures and I sent them some videos and I detailed to them what was going on, not only did they believe it, but they genuinely, there was this feeling of, oh, wow, like we really are screwed, aren't we? And I said, yes, we're absolutely, this is going to be a continuous disaster of epic proportion. And I never once thought that, you know, even though there have been the Palestinian national movement and the armed resistance in the past has engaged in some horrific crimes, either in the Munich attacks or the 1970s and 80s with a secular or Marxist resistance, or in the 90s and early 2000s with the Islamist resistance and the suicide bombings. But even though that was horrific in its own way, I was horrified that this was yet another chapter of brutality that I'm ashamed to have had that be permanently now associated with what I perceive as the urgent and just Palestinian quest for freedom and self-determination and statehood and sovereignty. The other thing that I will say is that I understand Hamas. I mean, to me, this is not just an opposition to Hamas based on their ideology, but or based on what I perceive are their corrupt practices, etc. But for years and years and years, like through my own personal professional work or just through my contacts, hearing about what Hamas does to torture people, hearing about Hamas beating up protesters, hearing about Hamas schemes for essentially like siphoning off not just the aid that's coming in now, but historically a lot of the development money that makes it into the Palestinian territories, or in Gaza in particular, how Hamas had the best of both worlds. Basically, it outsourced its responsibility as a government to the United Nations, to UNRWA, and turned its people into aid-dependent subjects while it received funding from Iran for its militant component and armed resistance efforts, and money from Qatar and other sources for its members, for its leaderships, for its government. So like there's just thousands and thousands worth of, I don't know how to quantify them, call them words, call them pages, call them minutes of conversations that I have had recently and historically, and since 2006 when Hamas won the election, since 2007 when they violently took over the Gaza Strip. They took over on June 14th, 2007, which was actually the very day that I was 17, but I was here in the United States having a political asylum interview. The very day of my interviews when they took over. So all of that information enables me to be like, okay, well, there's obviously Israeli propaganda, and some of it is real, some of it has kernels of truth, some of it I think is false. But nevertheless, I have a detailed understanding of how nefarious and destructive and sinister Hamas is in a way that a lot of others, including, again, the well-intentioned pro-Palestine people who think they know and think that simply by just focusing on Israel and everything is Israel's fault, that is somehow doing a service to the Palestinian people, when I actually think it's doing a disservice, because we need to normalize critique of Hamas. We need to isolate them. We need to humanize our people. We need to separate Hamas from Palestine. We need to condemn them and isolate them and call them out, not normalize normalize them and call them resistance fighters and call and legitimize essentially the horror that they did on October 7th. And I try to write about this, like I'll leave you with this, like one of the biggest challenges for me, unfortunately, and yes, I'm big on dialogue, I'm big on engagement. And I have a large following of pro-Israel folks or Zionists or self-described Zionists and right-wing Zionists and left-wing Zionists and centrists, or a lot of Israelis across the spectrum. And I that is deliberate. That is by design, because that is an unreachable target audience right now. And I want to build bridges, because peace and coexistence are the only path forward. But one of the challenges for me is that there's so much that I know about Hamas. There's so much that I want to talk about Hamas from their tunnel digging, from their use of civilian infrastructure, from their even strategies, indirect strategies of using human shields. It's not like they're holding Gazans and being like, okay, like, let me use you as a shield, but it's an indirect strategy. I want to write, I have hundreds of thousands worth of words that I want to write about it, but I struggle, and I still am writing about it, but I struggle with that, because that then gets picked up by folks who are blindly pro-Israel, and then they use it to say, oh, look, Ahmed, he's a Gazan. It gets used to dehumanize my people. It gets used to justify horrible mistakes by the IDF, including the killing of dozens of my family members, to say, oh, well, don't blame us, the IDF, blame Hamas for using them. It's like, that's where I struggle, is like, how can I relay this information as a matter of a historical record? And I have the gift of writing and the gift of just being, kind of detached a little bit without inadvertently fueling the dehumanization of Gazans and my own people.
It's hard to be an honest man. I feel for you, because I know how often things get taken out of context like that. Any nuance that you try to offer is going to be stripped away, often in those kind of propaganda settings. Let's turn to what's happening on the ground now and the tragedy you're talking about. I look, again, it's very hard for those of us who aren't on the ground to understand what's happening. It's pretty clear to me that much of the northern part of Gaza has been reduced to rubble, a significant part. My impression is that Israel made some effort, maybe a lot. I want to be open-minded about it. I like to think we made a big effort to evacuate people, to encourage them to leave before those buildings were destroyed. And obviously, there are precision bombings that Israel does that literally take out a handful of people. And we also make mistakes, and we maybe do some cruel things that are unacceptable. I I'm proud of the fact that Israel, at least to some extent, investigates certain incidents. I hope what happened to your family is investigated, but it may turn out it was just callous, insensitive, just an error, and God forbid, it could even have been done on purpose. I don't know, obviously, and I hope we find out. But talk to me about what you experience, again, from talking to people in Gaza now, about what it's like on the ground there. Because at the same time that the northern part of Gaza looks like the moon, there's meaning totally decimated. There's a refugee camp further south. You'll tell me the name. It's Deir al something. And, I saw a video yesterday of people buying Valentine's Day presents for their wives. And you see in the background, there's a lot of people on the street, but there's some normal life. And yet, at the same time, I'm aware that when 2.2 million people, or a good chunk of them, are trying to get away from bombing and are in a very small area now, which is mainly Rafah, as far as I understand, there's really no place left to go. And Israel's going in there, and it's horrible because that's where we think Hamas is. It's where we think the last remaining hostages, we don't know how many are alive even. Talk to me about that. Talk to me about, share your own tragedy, which, again, I salute you as a fellow human being and as a bridge builder, that you've maintained your humanity in the face of that loss. So talk to me.
So starting with October 13th, soon after the horrible events of October 7th and the massacre, that's when my family home where I grew up was hit. There was no, and I've kept in contact too with, I've kept tabs on understanding who are my family members, who are they associated with, what are they doing? And again, with the full confidence that I have, I can assure you that there were no tunnels or Hamas militants or fighters in that building where I grew up, which is multiple stories, and each uncle, my dad lived and our family lived on one story, and then each uncle kind of builds above. That's a very common Gazan practice due to the lack of space. So it was hit with 33 people, no warning, and miraculously, most survived in that building, although a lot of people were injured horribly. And my brother and his children were there, and he has 4 kids, and he and his 13-year-old boy pushed their way out of the rubble to try to escape, and everything was gone. Then some of my uncles and some of my cousins moved over just a few houses down to try and seek safety with their in-laws. And then on the 25th, about a week later, or 2 weeks later, another massive strike basically wiped out the whole neighborhood. And that's when I lost my dad's brother, my Uncle Riyadh. We had lost my niece and my cousin's daughter, who's 13 years old. She was one of the twin. And my cousin, who's quadriplegic, then became quadriplegic, and my uncle's body wasn't retrieved for 9 days. And then slowly, my brother and their family and his family began moving from house to house, kind of even southern Gaza, moving south within Gaza City. He works for an international NGO, and he was responsible for a lot of not just some efforts that he was working on, but he was also looking after our surviving family members who were in the Shifa hospital and who were injured. And basically, he made the decision not to leave the north because he said if he left, they would die. There's no one just to even change their gauze and kind of administer basic care due to just the sheer numbers of casualties. And then they slowly started making their way down south. Right now, Rafah is horrible. Yes, you see Rafah and Deir al-Balah. You see resemblance of what looks like daily living, people walking around, people going, trying to fetch food, trying to fetch water, trying to fetch supplies. Some of that is just organic things that people have had, and it's dwindling and running out. Some of that is those tiny bit of the trickle of aid making it through the Rafah and Kerem Shalom crossings. There's unfortunately multiple things can be true also at once. For example, some people who have some money are able to afford the extremely expensive supplies that are in there. Some of these supplies are stolen aid goods that resold for massively inflated prices. And that's done partly by Hamas, partly by organized crime, partly by just desperate civilians who are basically, they're like, okay, well, I have a little bit of food, but my mom has diabetes and there's like very little medication of that left in Gaza, but it costs 1,000 shekels. And so I'm going to take the little bit of food that I have and go and kind of like do a little stand in the street and sell it. It's like some of that is barter-based system. Some of that is just utter desperation. Also, and a lot of these things are incredibly uncomfortable to talk about, but I mean, we're talking, people haven't taken showers in weeks. And even if you do clean up, it's simply just, you do a basic wipe, you do just a basic wash. Like, imagine going through that. You can't do laundry. You can't, it's cold. A lot of children are and young girls are placed in horrendous crowded conditions. They're at elevated risks of sexual abuse and being molested or whatever. Like, there's just layers upon layers upon layers. Then there's obviously the elephant in the room, which is ongoing Israeli bombardment. Ongoing in that it doesn't always happen in a sustained fashion. Sometimes it's like a series of strikes, successive strikes, and those tend to be particularly horrifying because when they happen, those tend to be like when you have the fight or flight, response. There's fight or flight or freeze when a bunch of strikes happen at once. You see them and they surround you and they call them these fire belts. These successive strikes. You're like, oh, like where do we go? What do we do? Versus like one strike here, all right, like you can retreat somewhere. So then you have the threats of the incursions in Rafah, where people are like, well, okay, like we want to head back up to Deir el-Balah, to the center. My brother, who again went through 7 different displacements, with each time the place that he and his team were at being partially or fully destroyed. Now they're in Rafah. They found a place in central Gaza in Deir el-Balah. And then all of a sudden, after they found this place for his team, there was just an unprecedented increase in the amount of bombardment, such that 2 days ago, and I shared this on Twitter, like there were 3 families that had fled Rafah, and went to the center in anticipation of this military operation. And then they were killed there. So like the height of the horrible irony is that they might have been better off just staying in Rafah than leaving. So the IDF has identified a bunch of supposed safe zones along the coast. And we can talk about this more in detail later. But you can't simply just tell people, okay, well, here's a bunch of like coastal areas, like right on the water where it's freezing, where there's sand dunes. Like there's nothing. There is no infrastructure, no tents, no access to any food. You're cut off from any tiny supplies that are coming through the Rafah crossing. People aren't just going to pack up and say, okay, well, let me leave my tent and whatever and go and freeze to death in front of the ocean. So like, that's where I have been calling for the IDF itself, because it has units there, the United Nations, Arab nations, using small boats that can offload some tents and supplies and some food to make it feasible for people to just sustain themselves, to not freeze to death or starve to death onto the coast. So it's again, layers upon layers, from the bombardment, from the lack of treatment, from just, you have blood pressure, you have diabetes, you have any chronic illnesses and diseases. Forget any kind of follow-up or care, or even having regular access to your medication. You have the weather conditions. You have I had friends who were doctors who went in there as part of delegates to go and do surgeries in Deir el-Balah and Khan Yunis's Nasser hospital before it was taken out of commission. And now they're the Emirati Field Hospital in Rafah, or the Yusuf al-Najjar Hospital, which my uncle, who was killed in an airstrike, used to manage. He retired a few years ago. They speak of the stench, man, just of garbage everywhere, of the smell of dust, the smell of gunpowder. Like I said, the lack of sanitation, people haven't showered, people haven't taken, people can't do laundry. Just the smell of death, it's just the stench. Gaza is now just has the stench of misery that you can just immediately detect any and everywhere you go.
So the terrible dilemma, regardless of how one feels about the Israeli Defense Force and the cruelty or misfortune of the aftermath of October 7th. Israel has this terrible dilemma, which is that Hamas doesn't wear uniforms, obviously, or if they did, they don't now. Hostages are mingled in with everyone else, as are their keepers. And we're kind of desperately eager to get those folks back. I feel the people who claim that Israel's genocidal in its response, Israel could have easily decimated much larger swaths of Gaza than it has. We did see people streaming away from the north in the early days of the war. It's a terrible situation. I think any compassionate human being, regardless of their political views, has to empathize with what you're describing. And yet, we don't have an easy path as long as Hamas is, quote, in control or could regain control. I think right now their sovereignty is very decentralized, is my impression. But we want our citizens back. We don't want this to become a common occurrence. It's already scary. What could make this better? I mean, some people suggested, in a minute we'll talk about longer run solutions, which you write about in your piece. They're very thoughtful. I call those intermediate solutions. But just if you think about it from the Israeli perspective, what I would have liked is for the world to tell Qatar that it's unacceptable to shelter the leadership of Hamas. It's unacceptable to fund Hamas, which clearly was not widely shared among the people of Gaza. And there should be pressure for Hamas to surrender and to give the hostages back. Hasn't really happened. So we're pursuing a military solution, which is horrible. My heart goes out to you, Ahmed. It's brutal. I live in Jerusalem. There aren't a lot of airports in Jerusalem. None. What there are air bases. And when I hear planes in the air, I know where they're going. And a friend of mine reminded me that they're going to kill people. And some of them are not Hamas. They're innocent people, as you have tragically described. So it's a terrible thing. Any thoughts on what might have made it better? Did we have a better strategy in responding to October 7th in your mind?
To begin answering that is that and while I speak for myself, I can confidently tell you that a huge number of Gazans don't want Hamas. They don't want the group to be back in charge. They want this to end as soon as possible. We share the goal of seeing a fundamentally transformed Gaza with a different future and a different administration. I have studied elements of military science and insurgencies and counterterrorism, intelligence and national security. And what I will tell you is that, unfortunately, there are inherent limits to what can be achieved militarily when organizations like Hamas or others hold hostages. I mean, look back at the crisis of the American hostages in Iran in 1979 and 1980. Look back at what happened with the pirates in Somalia for years, but initially at least back in 2007, 8, and 9, when they were taking hostages from commercial ships. And the strategy initially was very much so to negotiate, to have a negotiated settlement of a lot of these hostage-taking situations. Look at what happened with Bo Bergdahl. There are multiple examples where Bo Bergdahl was a U.S. soldier in Afghanistan who was released in a deal with the Taliban. So I don't think there's an alternative to negotiating with Hamas and to having a settlement that entails the release of some Palestinian prisoners. Now, who gets released and how. I understand that's the thorny sticking point. And I also know that Hamas is now presenting pie in the sky, like ridiculous conditions, or statements about, they called this the Aqsa flood, and now they want to present things about the Aqsa Mosque and what's happening in Jerusalem, etc., which is not even under the Palestinian sovereignty. It's like between Israeli control and the Jordanians. It's like, I do think Hamas's negotiating strategy and positions are ridiculous, and I wish, and you saw what I wrote in Foreign Policy, I called for unprecedented pressure on Qatar to get Hamas to moderate its positions, even if we have to push the Qataris through kind of the cornerstone of their national security, which is the Al Udeid Air Base. And I've talked to I put that out there because a lot of people are thinking it, but for some reason it's very taboo in Washington to bring that out, even though people are genuinely thinking it, and they know that Qatar would ditch Hamas and wants to ditch Hamas, which is ultimately becoming a geopolitical headache. So that's where I believe that I don't believe the military strategy right now is going to help with either retrieving the hostages, which we know a lot of hostages were killed by a lot of the bombardment. Yes, of course, like it's criminal for Hamas to have them in the first place. 1,000%. But because of how they're dispersed in tunnels above ground among the population, and because of few attempts we saw at increasing pressure on Hamas, hostages were killed by Israeli bombardment. So I dispute the idea, with the exception of the limited successful operation, which we know came at the expense of dozens of Palestinian civilians and children in Rafah last week. This operation has not achieved that goal, number one. Number two, in terms of degrading Hamas, I mean, I don't think you can do both at once. I don't think you can you can pressure Hamas to release the hostages while also degrading the group's military capabilities because of how they fight, because of how they're embedded among the population. Even though you can weaken Hamas, you can't fully eliminate them. And I don't know that eliminating Hamas fully and entirely should even be the goal. I think you weaken Hamas enough to prevent them from controlling Gaza, prevent them obviously from launching another massive attack on Israel. And then you do a political settlement to basically starting out with a long-term truce, 5, 10, 15 years between Israel and Hamas. You basically push for some kind of a political and administrative rehabilitation of Hamas, what remains of Hamas in Gaza, even though you offer alternate options for leadership to leave, but the actual rank and file, just like we saw with the PLO in the Oslo peace process, just like we saw with the FARC rebels in Colombia, just like we saw with the IRA in Northern Ireland. There are precedents where people who were involved in either violent ideologies or extremist actions, with the exception of those who were maybe involved in especially egregious acts, there could be a political path forward to basically transform what remains of Hamas and turn them into a new administration. So that's my vision. Is I don't think the military operation. I talked to families of hostages. I talked to a couple of former hostages who were held by Hamas and released. And I mean, and I've been making a point of trying to humanize the hostages. And anytime I talk to Palestinians or pro-Palestine activists or people who want to do a ceasefire, proposal or resolution at city councils and across the United States, I say, don't call for a ceasefire without calling for the immediate and release of Israeli hostages. Pair both of them. Like, you cannot forget about the hostages. You cannot lose sight of the humanity of the hostages while also mourning the lives of dead Palestinians. So I don't believe the current campaign is going to retrieve the hostages, unfortunately.
And I don't know about that. But I agree with you. I don't think it's possible to, quote, eradicate Hamas. Some people say you can't eradicate it anyway. It's an idea. But to me, the only goal, presidents, prime ministers, premiers often say things for public consumption and motivating the populace that are unrealistic in wartime. It's nothing new there. The real goal that every Israeli cares about is that Hamas be unable to do this again. And more importantly, anybody who comes after Hamas would be either unable or uninterested in doing it. For us, our worry, I think, for many Israelis is that first, there isn't a rehabilitation possible because the anti-Semitism, the Jew hatred of some of the pieces of the leadership in the Gaza Strip is endemic. It's built in. I'd love to be told it's not true. I desperately want to believe that that the vast majority of Gazans simply want to have a better life and a better life for their children. But I also respect the fact that they also care about their identity and where they live and how their agency and may feel passionately as I do that this land is mine. They may feel the same way. And when you say from the river to the sea, you're saying, I want that land, not the Jewish state. So talk about your relative optimism or pessimism that there's a future for you and me to be friends. Because I desperately want to believe in that. And we can be friends in the abstract because you're living in the United States and you're a thoughtful and empathetic person, but that your people and our people here in Israel could be friends. What do you think?
So absolutely. And I have every reason to be optimistic. And that's not, I'm not just saying that out of thin air or some kumbaya notions. But prior to that, I do want to stress something that I think we should, in the moment, reflect back upon. And we're not gonna do that right this minute. But Hamas was allowed to grow and fester in Gaza. And there was a political decision made by the leadership within Israel to not, I'm not going to say specifically, like, it might have not been this like, oh, yes, let them become so powerful so that they can attack us. And like, maybe not in a conspiratorial manner, but it was very much so perceived to be this clever political 3D chess, if you will, to divide the Palestinians, to weaken and undermine the Palestinian Authority, which I used to be and still am in a lot of ways, but I used to be a fierce critic of the Palestinian Authority. Nevertheless, they were one of the viable few hopes we had at normalizing nonviolent political diplomatic engagement as the only way, even though Arafat made a horrible decision in 2000 to walk away from Camp David. Mahmoud Abbas made an even worse decision in 2008 to walk away from the Ulmer deal. I concede that. Nevertheless, this idea that you're going to weaken the Palestinian Authority by allowing Hamas to kind of turn Gaza into this resistance citadel, into this terrorism HQ, I think not only backfired horribly, but allowed Hamas to hold Gazans and my folks hostage. Because Gazans are held hostage, have been, by Hamas, even though there's ideological support for Hamas. There's support for some of the resistance. There's kind of like a network of affiliates and membership and whatever. There are people that casually support Hamas. They want a job, like whatever. There's tiers of why people have supported Hamas or have liked Hamas, just like there are tiers of why people oppose Hamas ideologically, politically, from the consequences that Hamas brings, or because it has set our people back by decades. So I think it's important to acknowledge that Hamas's power and the degradation of Gaza, not just politically and militarily, but even like allowing for almost 20 years, almost for 2 decades of this space where you let a violent terrorist organization with an extremist ideology incite and brainwash and hold its people hostage. That is not entirely organic, because people hate the Jews or they want from the river of the sea. That was the consequence of a series of political decisions. So flipping back to Gaza, I mean, yes, absolutely, because of this horrible situation that we're in and the horrible deaths and the horrible massacres of entire civilian neighborhoods and entire families, it's going to be difficult for a lot of people to hold conciliatory feelings towards long-term prospects. However, we cannot wait for everybody in Gaza to harbor pro-coexistence and pro-peace feelings before we actually start taking steps. In the same way that we cannot wait for a lot of the extreme right-wingers in Israel and the Ben-Gvirists and the Smotriches of the world and their following to all of a sudden start embracing Palestinians as real people worthy of life or worthy of sovereignty. Both of those camps have to be bypassed. There has to be, and some of that will take time. Some of that will be a function of improved, stopping the war, stopping the killing, allowing people to live, allowing people to be free from horrible leadership that has held them hostage and has launched this unbelievable, disaster upon them. And I can promise you that even though we see some pockets of protests here and there throughout Gaza, and we still do, but if you're standing in line with 100 other people waiting to use a single disgusting toilet, you're not standing there thinking, gee, Hamas did me a solid with this horrible, event of October 7th. If you're desperate for food and water and medication, or if you're cold, or if your kids are dead, you might, on the surface of your head, be thinking, oh my God, like Israel did this. This is criminal. This is horrible. And you're also deep down saying, this was entirely avoidable. This was a war started by Hamas. The other day I was talking to a Gazan, I swear to God, brother, he told me on October 6th, we soaked our hummus, our garbanzo beans. We packed our lunches. We fueled our cars. We were ready for October 7th to be yet another day of us trying to live and move forward. This was entirely avoidable. We thought we were going to send our kids to school. We were just going to carry on just another day. And instead, Hamas chose to do this thing. Like, what did they think? Of course, Hamas knew that Israel would have this overwhelming response. And it is counting on the overwhelming deaths and civilian casualties to pressure Israel to stop this attack. So when I say in my Atlantic article, and my piece in Haaretz, and in my piece in the Times of Israel, and in my other writings and opinions on Twitter, that I believe out of this misery, out of this horrendous series of atrocities committed by Hamas, and certainly by the Israeli government and by the Israeli military, I will never shy away from criticizing that and saying that, because I experienced it. When I say that, out of all that, I genuinely believe that the seeds for a different future, for a different approach, that is driven by pragmatism, that is driven by, okay, we've tried for 75 years, big picture. We've tried the pan-Arabism, we've tried the secular nationalism, and now we've tried the violent Islamism. Every year we keep losing more people, more territory, more standing, more maybe, just maybe we want to try something else. Maybe, just maybe Hamas is full of crap and is not the resistance group that we thought it is. Maybe Hamas is genuinely wanting us to die while they are in the tunnels so that they can use that to delegitimize Israel and to create public pressure. Maybe, just maybe, the only path forward is for life, not martyrdom. Maybe, just maybe, we're yearning for the days. I mean, I'll be honest with you. It was a very close family member, and let me just not say who it was. They were like, our hope lies with being open and connected with Israel from an economic, healthcare, and just kind of development point of view, not with Egypt, because the Egyptians have a lot of problems, economic, political. Sinai's kind of a desolate area, whereas Israel is right next to us. It's like they were like, this family member of mine, this close family member of mine was saying, like, I hope to God we don't get fully integrated with Egypt, because that will actually long-term have, serious economic and political and living standards, our living standards, and our prospects for a prosperous future would degrade. So it may not start with what you and I are able to do, which is having these detailed conversations that we can agree on some things, we can disagree on some on other things. I genuinely like you as a human being. I genuinely don't want you. I think I would love to have you as a neighbor. I think you have every right to be there, just as I have every right to be there. It might not start with what you and I share, but it absolutely over time. And if, again, people are able to live, people are able to just carry out the most basic functions in life, I think there's definitely a path forward whereby some of this hatred and some of this incitement can be undone. I think I look back at the 90s and how day laborers in Gaza and in Palestinian laborers, but especially in Gaza. The joke was Gazans occupied Israel in the 90s because of just how many day laborers were in there. And they weren't just standing outside of, workstations. They were working amazing jobs. And half of Gaza was built by money brought back from these day laborers. They built friendships and connections with Israelis. It is entirely possible. And I genuinely see a path forward for that, even though it's going to take time. And, we shouldn't wait for all of that hatred to be undone to actually take steps that almost impose peace on both parties.
As beautifully said, the tragedy is in the 90s, you had the day laborers. Even in 2023, you had people, it was a small number, tens of thousands, but it was not zero, who were working in Israel, coming out of Gaza. And tragically, our perspective is that some of those people were scouting out opportunities to kill the people they were working with and to provide intelligence for the attacks of October 7th. It's unbearable, especially because the people who died, many of them were desperately eager to do the kind of connecting that you and I care about. They were so-called peace activists who were trying to build bridges between themselves and the Palestinians in Gaza. So my question is, if we, and I encourage listeners to read your foreign policy piece, you have some specific suggestions. But what I'm thinking of is the following. Let's pretend Hamas is out of control, not in control. Let's pretend there's an international security force. Maybe, as you suggest, it's Egyptian, Jordanian. Maybe it's from Norway, our favorite international, unhated local security authority. That airport opens that you've been working on. A seaport opens that you advocate for in this piece very, I think, eloquently and appropriately to allow at least humanitarian aid to get to some innocent people who should not be cold, hungry, and suffering. And we're in that world. And in that world, Gaza starts to thrive economically because there's economic activities. The trust gets rebuilt between our two peoples. Those day laborers start to come back, and Gaza starts to thrive. Do you believe that will be enough for the people who live there? So you made a reference at the beginning of our conversation with people who are refugees and non-refugees. The refugees are people who came, whose families, which I think include yours. You said your parents were born in Rafah, but I think your grandparents came from what is now Israel. Those are called, right? And those are called refugees. So one of the sticking points for a political solution has been the right of Palestinians to have the property that they had either walked away from or were expelled from in what is now Israel. And I think for many Israelis and Jews around the world, slogans like "From the River to the Sea" are basically saying, we want that land back. And for those of us who live here now, we're saying, well, that we understand you might want it back, but we live here and you can't live here in large numbers. We'll lose our Jewish majority, won't be a Jewish state anymore, or won't be a democracy. We had a choice. Neither one. We're in a bind. Could you imagine a world where the people of Gaza and let's leave the West Bank out of it because it's another level of complication. But the people in Gaza would say, my family grew up in Haifa. I had a beautiful house there, but I'm going to build a beautiful house here in Gaza City when it's rebuilt with the billions of dollars that will come back. I'm sad that you lost your childhood home. It's unbearable. But something nice could be rebuilt there. It won't be your home. It'll be something else. But the people and your children and your children's children and your cousins and your nephews that are alive could have a better life there. Would that be enough? Because I think after October 7th, Israelis look at this and say, well, if it's never going to be enough, we don't have a really attractive path forward that involves coexistence. So what are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. The first part of your question, it'll be enough as a starting point to get the humanitarian aid in. That's why, in the short term, I want to get food and humanitarian aid in. I want to stabilize Gaza. I want to help Gazans stay on their land, not flee to Egypt, with the assumption that the hostages are out. Let's assume in a month or two, either a negotiated deal or a political settlement. But the first priority is stabilize, get the aid in, prevent hunger, get medical and food and other critical need. Commercial goods. There's a feminine hygiene crisis in Gaza where women don't have basic needs for dealing with periods and menstruation. So stabilize and then open Gaza up to the rest of the world beyond just the traditional pathways, which is either the Erez crossing for passengers in the north, the Kerem Shalom with Israel for goods and cargo, or the Rafah crossing. By allowing humanitarian air operations, which the UN does in conflict zones throughout the world, by allowing a provisional seaport to take place, I genuinely think that'll stabilize Gaza, whereby for the short term, that's what people want, is we just to rebuild their lives. However, economic development alone, without a political horizon for Palestinian statehood and Palestinian control and sovereignty, will not work. And I respect him dearly, Salam Fayyad, in the West Bank, and he was sabotaged. There were people that tried to undermine him. But we saw in the West Bank, while Hamas did its resistance citadel, the West Bank had a chance to develop and prosper. And during the Salam Fayyad years, there were reforms and institution buildings in the Palestinian Authority that I think were unprecedented and were incredibly positive, but unfortunately were not followed up for a variety of reasons, including Abbas walking away from the Olmert proposal in 2008. They were not followed up by a political horizon and path forward. So therefore, economic development alone is never going to be enough to break this cycle and solve this once and for all. As for the right of return, and I've written about this. I'm under no illusion that, millions of Palestinians and their descendants will simply be allowed to go back to historic Palestine. What I have been calling for, and I genuinely think was a horrendous mistake. After 1948, between 1948 and 1967, we had the West Bank and Gaza, but it was under Jordanian control and Egyptian control. Why wasn't a Palestinian state established? Why weren't these on those two territories? And we had East Jerusalem, and East Jerusalem could have been declared the capital of the Palestinian state instead of the Egyptian and Jordanian administration. Why weren't the refugees from the Syrian and Lebanese and Jordanian camps resettled in the West Bank, which is large, it was free of Jewish settlers? Why weren't they resettled there and allowed to rebuild their homes in there? That's the chronic failure of Palestinian leadership, in that unfortunately there is this call it lack of vision, call it lack of leadership, call it lack of pragmatism, call it these maximalist simplistic ideas that, okay, well, we got to have the right of return. I believe in the right of return, but I believe in the right of return happening largely to the West Bank and to Gaza. I believe in developing both of those places so that if I'm a Palestinian refugee in Lebanon or Syria living in horrible second-class ghettos where I'm not allowed, in Lebanon, you're legally not allowed to work outside of the refugee camps that are run by UNRWA. I'm going to be like, you know what? I want to go to the West Bank and start a new life, honestly. Like that's where, there's cultural differences, whatever. But that's what I believe we should do as Palestinians, whereby, look at places like Hong Kong or Singapore. You can do so much with small spaces. I'm not saying Gaza is going to become the Singapore. I feel like that's a simplistic propagandist point. But nevertheless, Gaza has it can have an airport and a seaport. It has a promising gas field. Gaza can be developed, and we can have so much that we can do just with what we have. Same in the West Bank. The West Bank is incredible. There's a lot of space. If those Jewish settlements are vacated, if you do territorial swaps, you can build entirely new communities. And that's where I do believe there should be some compensation from Israel, some agreement, some mechanism, either helping build new communities for Palestinians in the West Bank, or the part of the territorial swaps that you're going to do for Palestinian refugees, that essentially the decommissioning of UNRWA. Okay, help us build these new communities so that the right of return happens in Palestinian territories, in a future Palestinian state, not in Israel, which I genuinely believe is the only pragmatic, reasonable path forward on that particular issue.
My guest today has been Ahmed Alkhatib. I'm going to say that again. We'll correct it. My guest today has been Ahmed Fouad Alkhatib. Ahmed, I hope someday we'll have a cup of coffee or a beer or a falafel or shawarma, either in the West Bank or Gaza or in Jerusalem. And thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Inshallah. I'm confident we will. Thank you for having me.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.